Hello, everyone, and welcome to our video contribution for Azure Back to School, a great community initiative set up by Dwayne Netwick to share knowledge and help people learn new things and improve their skill set. In this video, Micha and myself will tell you all about Azure Private Link and Azure Private Endpoint and what's so private about it. So, what are we going to talk about? And keep in mind, this is for your eyes only. First of all, we will talk about Azure Private Endpoint and Azure Private Link. We'll tell you about what it is and what you can do with it. And of course, we also show some demos in between. Then Micha will look into the Azure Private Link service and also into the pricing. Because yeah, at the end of the month, someone still needs to pay the Azure bill. And then I will talk about how you can use a Cloud Shell into a VNet. And at the end of the video, we also go through some key takeaways where we will focus on the things we think you should really remember about our recording.
Yes, a small introduction. So my name is Micha. I'm owner of Cloud.Architects. At daytime, I work as a technology strategist at Aspects, but also WVD or AVD solution architect at NXP. Proud board member of MC2MC, the awesome user group where Wim and myself are a member of. And since the end of 2018, became Microsoft MVP on Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows Virtual Desktop before, but now Azure Virtual Desktop. You can see my Twitter handle over here, the blog page, and also the LinkedIn page. So if you want to contact me, do not hesitate to contact me on any of those channels.
So, okay, let me also shortly introduce myself for the people who don't know me. My name is Matthyssen. Just as Micha, I also live in Belgium, where I work as an Azure technical advisor. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer and an Azure MVP. And next to that, I'm also, just as Micha, a founding board member of MC2MC. I also have my own blog, https://wmatthyssen.com, where I blog a lot about my daily experiences with Azure and all related Microsoft hybrid cloud services. And like most IT professionals these days, I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you ever want to reach out, just say hi, or yeah, if you have a question about Azure Private Endpoint or Private Link, you can always contact me through my Twitter handle or through LinkedIn, or yeah, you can simply scan the QR code at the bottom of the slide. So I think it's now time to start off with the first topic. So I think Micha, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Before we start with Azure Private Link and service, we need to start at the base, which is the private endpoint. So the Azure Private Endpoint. This is the description from Microsoft. So it's a network interface which connects you privately and securely to a service, which is powered by Azure Private Link. But let's focus on private endpoint first. So private endpoint is using a private IP address from within your own virtual network, your own VNet, and it brings a specific service into your VNet. So it can be a service from yourself, it could be a service from a different department in your company, but it can also be a service from a third-party vendor. And this service can be many things. We have a few examples over here, like Azure Storage, Cosmos DB, SQL, etc. But these are just some examples. And it just connects you to that particular service. Important to know before you can start, using private endpoints, you need to make sure that your virtual network is capable of using private endpoints. So you cannot apply NSGs, network security policies, on private endpoints. It's just not supported. So you need to disable this setting on a subnet in your VNet where you want to use it. If you create a private endpoint using the Azure portal, which is quite easy, of course, the Azure portal will disable that policy setting for you on that VNet. If you do it through ARM, PowerShell, CLI, or anything else, you have to do it yourself. So you have to do it manually or through PowerShell. We have added a small snippet over here how you can disable the private endpoint network policies on a particular subnet. After that, you have a private endpoint which connects you to a service, but also important to keep in mind that that private endpoint gets a private IP from your VNet. You want to connect to that particular service. You will not do this through IP address, or I hope you will not do it through IP address. So you have to make sure that you can use a fully qualified domain name, the FQDN. This is an example how you can configure your DNS to connect to a file share. So what you do is in your Active Directory, you go to the DNS, you create a primary DNS zone. In this case, it will be the private link.file.core.windows.net. And you add the private IP address from your private endpoint. And in this way, you can use the FQDN to connect to the file share that you connect to a private endpoint. Let's see for the next slides. If you don't have a Active Directory integrated DNS, you can also use the private DNS zone. The same principle, you add the IP address from the private endpoint in your private DNS zone, and then you can easily use the fully qualified domain name. The same principle, but in Azure Private DNS Zone. And I think we are ready for the first demo. So enough talk, and let's dive into the first demo. Let me check my screen first. You should be able to see my screen any second now. At least if Teams allows it. Yes. So this is my Azure portal from my own environment. I have a storage account, and what I will do on that storage account, or what I have on that storage account, is a file share. Let me show you this one. So the file share with the profiles, typically used by AvisLogix, because you want to use Azure File Share to store your AvisLogix profiles, for example. So this file share is connected, and this is changed. Let me show you. Before, you could go to configuration and see which was joined into your Active Directory. So it's now changed into the file share page, and you have to click over here on Active Directory, which means that this file share is joined into my Active Directory. Once you have completed that setup, then you can go to networking. What I did is disable the access from all networks, because I only want to access this file share through my VNet. So I protected this through my VNet and the different VNet for my DevOps agents as well. I also added my own public IP just to make sure that I can connect. And what you then do is you go to private endpoints at the top, and you create a new private endpoint. Once you created the private endpoint and you go back to your resource group, you will see that you have two additional resources, one private endpoint and one network interface. Just as I said at the beginning, private endpoint is actually a private IP inside your VNet, so you get a network interface connected to your resource. And if we click through on that particular network interface, then you will see that we have a private IP inside our VNet. So what I did, I went into my Active Directory, into my environment, into my DNS zone. I created my DNS zone for the private link. I added a record pointing to that private IP address, making sure that this storage account name is now available as a FQDN in my environment. So what you can do, if I look at my Explorer, then you can simply browse to / storage account, file core windows.net / profiles. And the profiles, this is the share, the file share that we created right over here. So profiles. And I can simply access it and click through the FSLogix and use it as a file share directly attached into my Active Directory or into my virtual network. And to prove this to you, if we do a NSLOOKUP from this particular A record, then you will see that I get a private IP for connecting to our storage account. So it doesn't go over the internet, it's using a directly attached network interface inside my VNet. And in this way, you can completely protect that storage account and access it directly and much faster, of course. Back to you, Wim.
Okay, so let me share my screen again and the slide deck. So that should be showing now. So after that nice demo from Micha, we now want to look into Azure Private Link itself. So what is Private Link? If you look at the definition, you can say Azure Private Link provides private connectivity from a virtual network, a VNet, to Azure PaaS, customer-owned or Microsoft partner services. And if you then look a little bit deeper, you can say that Azure Private Link, which is a relative new functionality in Azure, allows you to create a private endpoint, like Micha showed you, in your virtual network, and enables you, by using that private endpoint, to access selected Azure PaaS services, like, for example, Azure Storage, an Azure SQL database, or even Azure Backup. By providing an internal IP or IPs for that specific PaaS service, it can not only be used for Azure PaaS service, but also to securely and privately access other partners, Azure partner services, or even customer-owned services, even if they're running in different tenants. And traffic between your virtual network and the service itself only travels over to Microsoft backbone network. So exposing your service to the public internet to make it available is no longer necessary. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So why would you use Azure Private Link? Well, first of all, and like I already said, to be able to privately access PaaS services on the Azure platform by providing you a private IP to reference your PaaS services. It will also allow you to access from both peers virtual networks, regional and global, and also from on-premise resources which are connected via an express route or site-to-site VPN. Next to that, it will also protect your Azure services against any form of data leakage. And last but not least, it will allow you to deliver your services directly to your customers, and this on a global scale. So before Azure Private Link, you could also access PaaS services such as Azure Storage or an Azure SQL database, which lived outside your VNet only via their public interface. You had the possibility to secure this connection by using VNet service endpoints, which kept the traffic also within the Microsoft Azure backbone. But yeah, then the PaaS service used the public IP address, and therefore you couldn't access it from any on-premise through a VPN gateway or through Azure Express Route private peering, for example. And that's where Azure Private Link comes in play. With Private Link, you simply create that private endpoint in your VNet and map it directly to your PaaS resource. Since those PaaS resources are now mapped to the private IP address in the VNet, they can also be accessed through ExpressRoute or through a site-to-site VPN. And this effectively means that the data will traverse a fully private path from on-premises to Azure. So like you can see on the screen, connectivity works from on-premises, even branch offices, and even from other clouds. And of course, it works within the same VNet, but also through the use of regional VNet or a global VNet peering, for example. Once again, because Azure Private Link maps a specific path resource to a private IP address, any malicious intent to exploit the data to a different account using the same private endpoint will fail. So in the event of any kind of security incident within your network, only the mapped resources would be accessible, and user access is really restricted to that specific resource, which can be a database or a storage account, or any other password resource, of course, and not to the whole service. So by using this, you have complete control of the data egress, and you are protected against any form of data leakage. Private Link also works between services and VNets across different tenants and even regions. So, for example, a consumer's VNet could be, let us say, located in West Europe, but through the use of an Azure Private Link, they can connect to a service provider's PaaS service located in, for example, the East US region, and this without even affecting any performance or causing any latency. So currently there are already a bunch of PaaS services which can be used in combination with Private Link. And keep in mind that Microsoft is still working on expanding the list with adding more and more services, focusing on the most critical ones in any customer's environments. So at the moment, you can use Private Link with Azure Files, Azure Storage, Azure SQL databases, Azure Key Vault, Azure Backup, to name some. But there are much more. So you can always check all the other supported ones through the link at the bottom of the slide. So a nice thing Micha and myself also want to mention is that Private Link also solves the overlapping address space problem. So like you probably know, and maybe you have seen, traditionally we use VNet peering as the mechanism to connect multiple VNets with each other. But VNet peering requires the VNets to have a non-overlapping address space. So, and like you know, in enterprise scenarios, you often find networks with overlapping IP address spaces. But with the use of Azure Private Link, you now also have the possibility to privately connect applications in different VNets to have, even if those have an overlapping IP address space. So definitely keep that one in mind when architecting any new greenfield or even brownfield Azure environments, because we think it can really save your day at the moment. So, but enough talking. There are also a few things we think you should keep in mind when you use Azure Endpoints and Azure Private Link. But let me first, oh, that's not good. Go to my Azure portal. See, I'm not in the correct tenant. Yeah, that's the one. So, for example, when you want to use a private link with the recovery service vault, you can simply go to your recovery service vault, open it. The first thing you need to do is create a managed identity. I always mostly use a system managed identity. You also have to give it the specific role assignments. I just gave this one the contributor role on the complete subscription, but you can also give them just the contributor role on the specific resource or even the resource group. It doesn't need to be that high in the scope, but yeah. So that's the first thing you need to do, create a managed identity. You can make your own or a system management. Then you go to private endpoint connections. You simply create your private endpoint. You create it and you deploy it. But the thing we really want to have you to keep in mind is that when you deploy that private endpoint, for example, with Azure Recovery Services Vault, you use it whenever you want to make SQL Server backups in your VMs, for example, and you want to keep those also on the Microsoft backbone and used by a private IP address, you need to set up it like this. So, but the thing we want to show you is if you open your virtual network, you can see whenever you set this up for Azure Backup and the Recovery Service Vault, that specific private endpoint is using 20 IP addresses. So keep that one in mind. So for example, also created one for a key vault that's just using one. But when you do it for a service like your recovery service vault, it's already using 20. So the thing we want to say is, and the thing we mostly do these days, is that we create a separated subnet, especially for all those IP addresses used by any private link. So think about it when you design your environment or when you want to start using private link. It's always a good idea to use a separated VNet, or even in your VNet, use a separated subnet with an address space that's big enough to cover all those IP addresses. So that's the thing we also want that you would keep in mind whenever you start using it. But Micha, I think we can go back to you for the next topic, I think.
Yes. So we explained the private endpoint. What is Azure Private Endpoint? Wim explained and showed the Azure Private Link. What if we can combine those? What if we can create our own Azure Private Link service? What is an Azure Private Link service? It's your own service that you provide, and which is powered by the Azure Private Link. Let's dive into this. So if you are running, for example, a virtual machine or a skill set or any other service, and you can put this behind a Azure Standard Load Balancer, then you can enable that service and enable it for private link service, which means that any consumer can create a private endpoint in its own VNet, in its own virtual network, and connect to your own Azure Private Link service to start using that particular service or entity that you run. As you can see over here in the picture, so on the right-hand side, you have virtual machines, two virtual machines and a scale set running. It's behind a standard load balancer. It needs to be a standard load balancer. And then in front of that, we put a private link service. On the customer side, we have a VNet. In that VNet, we have a private endpoint, and we link those two, the private endpoint and the private link service, through the Azure Private Link from Microsoft. And on the consumer side, the private endpoint can be used by virtual machines in its network, or as Wim also said, it can be connected through ExpressRoute, VPN gateway, or anything else to start using that private endpoint and connect to your own service. And in this way, we use all services, we combine everything, and we can really start or sell even that particular service to our customers. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we know how it works, how we can access it. First, we create our Azure Private Link service. We share it, and as soon as we share it, we get a particular name. So Microsoft calls it a moniker or an alias. And this alias can be shared with your customers or consumers, but it can also be a particular resource URI. Like, for example, if you create a key vault, you always get a full resource URI. You can also use that one, or simply use that alias. You can also control how your service is exposed to the internet. It can be private, which means only your own VNets can access it. It can be restricted to a particular set of subscriptions, or it can be public, which means that you share the alias and everybody who knows the alias can request connection to your service. I always say requests because it's always a request approval cycles. So as soon as a consumer wants to connect, it creates a private endpoint and it has to request access to your service. And you, as a service provider, you need to accept that particular request before the consumer can start using that service for you. If you want to make it public and you don't want to approve everything, you can still configure a auto approve. So it can be configured to auto approve all the requests, so all the consumers can simply access your service. But keep in mind how you will configure this. Again, quite the same as we saw for the private endpoint. We also need to configure the subnet, which will host the private link service. Over here, we also need to disable the NSG policies. So again, if you configure it to the portal, it's done for you by the portal. If you do it through RM, PowerShell, CLI, or anything else, you have to do it yourself. Again, the same snippet, search your virtual network, put in the private link service network policy to disabled, and update your virtual network, and you're good to go. Again, enough talk. Let's see how it works, what we can do. Let me share my screen. Hopefully, Teams is faster. Yes. Okay. First things first. Let me show you my backend. So this is a resource group that I created. I have a virtual machine running. Important to see is that my virtual machine has a private IP address, but no public IP address. So by default, it cannot be accessed by any service except a virtual machine or a service inside that VNet. It's connected on 10.3.0.4, so this is the private IP address from my virtual machine. Next to that, I created a load balancer. As you can see, it's a standard load balancer. It's not a public, not a front end or a public load balancer. It's a internal load balancer. So it is connected to my VNet, and it also has a IP inside my VNet, a private IP. Then it has a backpool which connects to my virtual machine, and it will be using the standard TCP port 80 for HTTP connections. So compare it to a web server that you are running in your VNet, and on that web server you have a service or a website or anything else running, and you want to expose this to any consumer. After that, you can also configure a NAT gateway. Not required, but it's good to have a NAT gateway so it has a particular external IP address if you want. But the virtual machine itself has no public IP address. The NAT gateway is only for connecting to externally. What I did then is create, let me show you, is create a private link service. How do you do this? You simply type private link at the top of the search bar, you hit it, and on the private link center, you can see your private endpoints. So this contains all the private endpoints from your subscription or your environment, pending connections if you have any, but also the private link services. Over here, I simply clicked on add, went through the simple registration. And what I have right now is a private endpoint, which has a private IP inside my VNet because it's connected to my VNet. As you can see over here, it's inside my VNet, inside my subnet. And it's using, let me show you this. It's using my own subscription, and it's connected to my standard load balancer. This one is a bit too soon. My load balancer right over here. So you can see that it's using that internal load balancer connecting to my virtual machine. So right now I have a service with integration into my VNet, and it's using my load balancer to connect to my virtual machine. But as I said, you can configure, you get always an alias from Microsoft, and this is the alias which is globally unique and can be shared with your customers. If we click to the access security, you can see that I set anyone with your alias, which is the public variation. So anybody with my alias can request a connection to my service. And as you can see, auto approval can be configured if needed. So it can be set to auto approval. Right now, if anybody wants to connect, I have to accept this request. If we look at our virtual machine, the virtual machine has no public IP. What I did is, as you saw right over here, I created a Bastion instance, which is demoed a lot by Wim and myself. But this enables me to connect to my virtual machine without any public IP and simply request control of it. And as you can see, the ES is running, and I have a simple web page which indicates that it's this external server with its IP address. Nothing more, nothing less, simple web page. And as we open this one up, this will be the page that we want to access. This is my backend. So my backend is up and running. It has a page and everything is available. Now my service is running. A consumer wants to start using this, and I have this running inside a different environment. This different environment has also a virtual machine. It's not connected in any way to the other environment, so it's not connected. And if we look at this virtual machine, you will notice that we have the same private IP as the other virtual machine running in the backend. So normally, if we would want to connect those two environments using VNet peering or anything else, it would not work due to the same IP addresses in the two environments. As you can see, this is my VM, which is a consumer, and this is the virtual machine, which is the service, and it's both running in the same IP range. So typical VNet peering would not work, VPN gateway would have issues, so it will not work by default. But using the private link service, we can still connect our two services. So what I did, quite easy over here, I also went to my private link service. I went to private endpoints, clicked on add, and let me quickly show you this. It will ask for a particular subscription. If we go for this one, for example, it will ask for a resource group. It will ask for a name. Let me see, demo 1, and it will ask for a resource. And in this way, we can connect to a resource in my own directory, so my own Azure AD tenant, or it can be a resource ID or alias. And then you have to put in your alias, go through the next steps for configuration, and it will ask you to put in a request to put into the Azure Private Link service. What we then get as a service provider, if we would go into the Private Link service, Private Link Connection Center, we will get a connection request. So over here, we will see that a consumer is requesting access to get to our link service, and we can simply approve this one. As soon as this one is complete and we go back to our link service, then we will see that the Micha Back to School demo has a private endpoint, and the private endpoint is configured into our VNet. So this is now the private endpoint, which I already configured. And as you can see, it also creates a network interface because every private endpoint has a NIC, and that NIC is integrated into our subnet, and that subnet also contains our virtual machine. We also get the approval message from our service. And what I also did is configure our private DNS zone. And the private DNS zone has a record pointing to that other to that NIC that is now in our subnet. So it's not the other load balancer or anything else. This is the private IP from the network interface in my own VNet, and I assigned a simple name to it. Right over here, I'm connected to the virtual machine. Let me show you this so you are sure that I did not fake it. What I have over here, if I ping that DNS zone with that A records that I created, then you will see I get a private IP again. And if I open my Edge, go to the website, then you get the web page which is running on my virtual machine in the service endpoint. And to really prove that I did not fake this one, I go back into my Azure Bastion connection. Let me close and edit this for demo. Back to school. And if I save this one and I go back to my other virtual machine and hit refresh, then you will see that the web page has been changed. So even though my two virtual machines are now in the same IP range, I can still access that particular service. It's not VNet connected, it's not VPN connected or anything else. I just use in my consumer endpoint, my consumer VNet, a private endpoint, which points to this private link service of the service provider, and the service provider has a load balancer in front of its service and pointing to the consumer and allowing the consumer to access a service that he wants to provide to his customers. And in this way, even though we have overlapping IP addresses, it can still work. And we can still use FQDN for the entire services. Back to the slides, because we still want to talk about something really important, which is the pricing. It's something you need to keep in mind. As a service provider, there is no service fee or no charge for private link service. So the private link service at itself is free of charge. If a consumer wants to use your service, or if you want to use private endpoint for anything else, you pay for each hour that the private endpoint is created. So it's not much, but you pay by the hour. Also, inbound and outbound data is charged. So you get charged by inbound and outbound data that goes over your private endpoint. We put in an example here as well. If you write to a storage account, you get outbound data processed. If you don't write but only read, you also get the inbound data processed. So it's always processed either outbound or inbound into that particular endpoint. More information can see at the webpage from Microsoft, which is explained also by Microsoft, but not as clear as our presentation, of course. But just to give you an idea how the service is built. Back to you, Wim.
Yeah, thanks, Micha. So before going through the key takeaways, we also want to talk about our last topic and how you can use Cloud Shell into your Azure Virtual Network. So like most of you probably already know, is that a regular Cloud Shell runs in a container in a Microsoft network, which is separated from your other Azure resources. This means that the commands you run from inside the container cannot access any resources accessed from a specific VNet. So it's not possible to access a specific VM and send some commands to that one. But with the latest Cloud Shell update, you can now connect your Azure Cloud Shell directly to a VNet. And this new method allows you to use PowerShell remoting, SSH, and any other command line tool using resources' private IP addresses. And before you can use Cloud Shell in this way, of course, some new resources need to be there or need to be created to support this new functionality. First of all, you need a VNet, which is quite logic, in which the resources are located you want to manage, or a VNet that pairs with the VNet in which those resources are located. So if you're using a hub-spoke topology, it's best to select the hub VNet for this. You also need a dedicated subnet in that specific VNet to host the Cloud Shell containers. That's an important one to keep in mind. And you also need a network profile, which is a network configuration template that specifies certain network properties for those resources. And then you also need an Azure relay, which allows two endpoints that are not directly reachable to communicate with each other. In this specific scenario, it allows the administrative browsers to communicate with the container in the private network. And the last resource you need is a storage account with a file share to store your file. But I think that's still the same as before. There are also some considerations and limitations you need to be aware of. Since private Cloud Shell is still a preview feature, it's currently only available in the West US and West Central US region. So that's the most important thing. And because it's in preview, Micha and myself won't say you shouldn't use it for any of your production subscriptions, but that's a thing you should already know. Some other things to keep in mind is that the use of an Azure relay adds an additional cost because it's not a free service to use. And that starting up a Cloud Shell in a VNet will kind of slow down the startup speed of the Cloud Shell containers. So it will be slower than your regular Cloud Shell startup experience. And another thing you should keep in mind is that the Microsoft Container Instances resource provider needs to be registered in the Azure subscription that holds the VNet you want to use. So if you never worked with containers before, probably you need to add that one. And if you already used Cloud Shell in the past, so you configure it, you start using it for every other things without managing resources in your VNet, you need to unmount the existing cloud drive to get the new experience set up. And there's a simple command to do so. You just you open your Cloud Shell, type in cloud drive unmount or dismount cloud drive, and you will be able to reconfigure it. But let me shortly demo it. So that's my Azure portal. I already configured all the necessary resources in the back. There is an easy way to do it. There is a Microsoft doc which explains the different steps and also the different resources you need to use. It's this document. You can also, from over here, deploy those specific resources in your environment, or you can browse to the GitHub environment and do it from over there. An important thing to keep in mind whenever you do this is that you use one resource group for all those resources. For everything, it's for your VNet, for all your subnets. Yeah, that's logical because those are always together. Also for your storage account, which you deploy, and also for that container, that relay, etc., etc. It should all be in the same resource group. And definitely don't forget to use the West US region, because that's also an important part. So I already configured this. I have a specific resource group, like you can see over here. It's my networking resource group. You can see there are a lot of extra resources deployed. I have my private endpoint. I have my network interface. I even have a private DNS zone that's configured. I have the relay. I have the storage account. And of course, I have my virtual network. And in my virtual network, I have some specific subnets created, but that's it. So I already used Cloud Shell before in this environment, but I already ran that command to unmount my cloud drive. So the first thing that now happens whenever I open Cloud Shell, if I click on it, I need to reconfigure it. So I simply choose PowerShell. It's my right subscription. I click on the Show Advanced Settings. I click on Show Virtual Network Isolation Settings. I choose my correct region, which is West US. Still nothing showing. I choose my correct resource group, and everything pops up, and everything is filled in automatically, except of course the file share. So I still need to type in that one. Just simply type in Cloud Shell, which is the name of that file share, and then I click on Create Storage, and everything will be set up in the back. But this will take some time, so this is how you can set it up. Try it out. Do it in your testing environments with your test subscriptions, but yeah, we won't advise to use it for any production workloads. So, and whenever this is set up, I can connect to any of those containers or VMs that are configured in one of those peer VNets or in which are connected to my hub. So let me go back to the slides. So before closing up, we just want to give you some key takeaways. First of all, you should use private endpoints instead of service endpoints these days. They can exist together, but if so, try to switch to private endpoints. That's the new way to do it. You should use private link to privately access any PaaS service in your environment, in your VNets. Use, like Micha showed you, a private link service to enable a consumer to access your own services via private link. And the last one, keep an eye on your IP addresses whenever you create a private endpoint, because just like we showed you with the recovery service fault demo, they can pop up and they can really fill up your subnets. So also keep that one in mind. So, and with that being said, we're at the end of our recording. So thank you for your attention, and we hope you have learned something from our video. Also, be sure to check out all other videos and blog posts at https://azureBackToSchool.tech, because there will be a lot of other interesting topics covered over there. You can also keep an eye on Twitter for the Azure hashtags Azure Back to School and Azure Family. And don't forget to tweet about it yourself. And yeah, if you ever have a question related to Azure Private Endpoint, Private Link, or Private Link Service, you can always contact us through our Twitter handles. They're at the bottom over here at Micha and at Matthyssen. And the last thing we can say is thank you for your attention, and we hope to see you next time.
Yes, big thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.